Well, thank you all for your patience, and I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy out there. Thank you for letting us join you this morning. We're really excited to talk to you about some of our work that we've been doing mapping Washington's wildland-urban interface. First, we'll do a few quick introductions. So my name is Ashley Blazina. I'm with the Forest Health and Resiliency Division with the Washington Department of Natural Resources.
And I'm Kirk Davis. I'm the GIS lead for the Wildfire Division. And I like to think of myself as behind the scenes to all of this work. And so we're excited to present this to you all today.
Great. All right, so let's jump in. So the first thing is really the impetus for all of this work. Why did we need to do a wildland urban interface map at all? What was really the driving force? And for us, it was ESSB 6109. So we've actually been working on this particular project since late 2018 when we were directed that we needed to complete a statewide map of the WUI areas. And this was so that different counties that wanted to implement different aspects of the International Wildland Urban Interface Code had a better piece of a toolkit to really implement implement some of the regulations that they needed to for wildland urban interface areas. So to start out with, before we started mapping, we really had to define what the wildland urban interface was for Washington State. There's quite a few different WUI definitions out there. And we really had to figure out what we needed ours to be for the entire state of Washington. We have a lot of different types of WUI. And so we first started with just one of the earliest, if not the earliest, WUI definition from the Department of the Interior in their Federal Register interface. And I'm just gonna define these now in case anyone isn't necessarily that familiar with it, but these early definitions was interface was a community that exists where structures directly abut wildland fuels. So that's when structures are directly next to some of these undeveloped areas. And wildland fuels can be forests, it can be grasslands, it can be shrub steppe, anything that isn't developed with human structures, that can largely be wildland fuels. We'll get a little bit more into different types of fuels in a bit, but intermix is another type of WUI. An intermix is when structures are scattered throughout a wildland area. So that can be when there is those one-room cabins in the middle of the woods, surrounded by forest or grassland, that will be considered intermix, while interface is more of a one-sided or two-sided situation with the structures or a development being next to it. So we started with these two definitions, but we wanted to see how other areas at different scales had really defined WUI as well. So this is a few examples at different scales of city, county, and state that we looked at in terms of what are some of the things that at different scales people are including, what are some of the things that they're considering, and what are some of the similarities that they have. What do we really need to include if this is going to be something that needs to work as an umbrella for the entire state of Washington, but may also be something that is used as a tool at all of these different scales. So some of the things that we looked at were, what are some of the things that everyone was including? And this idea of human development meeting or intermingling, so that the meet is kind of that abut, as we saw with the interface from the interface definition from the Department of the Interior, where the intermingle is more of that intermix idea of the one-room cabin being within a more dense wildland area. And so that was something we saw with all of the WUI definitions that we came across. But then in other situations, such as Chelan County, we saw that it was the types of fuels and that ignition possibility was also included. In California, as another example, at a state level, their definition really was tied to some of the other definitions and regulations that they already had in place. And so it had a much more formal directive definition for the entire state. What we ultimately decided on, and I'm going to switch back to this previous slide, was interface was any areas. We did not want to include the word community in our definition, since community comes with its own connotations. And because we wanted wildland to really be defined as any structure, it's any area exists where a structure is directly abut wildland fuels. And so that can be one structure, it can be a neighborhood, but it doesn't have to be necessarily a community. So I'll go beyond from there. And so after we had more formally defined what WUI meant, we wanted to see how WUI was being implemented, what were some of the challenges within our own state for people who may have already defined it or who were working extensively in wildland urban interface areas. What are some of the things they had that were concerns for the future currently with how to regulate the WUI, how to plan for the WUI? What were some of the secondary considerations they had to include? So we focused a lot of our outreach in areas that were heavy WUI areas. So those areas that had some more of those developed areas that were right next to some of our larger national forests, national parks, some of the larger wildland areas, but also the areas where that dense population starts to spread out into the more wildland areas. So talking with people who were fire marshals, foresters, conservation district employees, building officials, folks who worked in emergency management, private industry, we really tried to get a good variety of voices in some of those early conversations and meetings to see how it was really going to affect the different fields that are all going to be working in the WUI. What are some of their concerns? What are some of the challenges that they have or that they foresee? And how is that going to affect how we're going to be mapping the wildland urban interface? We then talked with the Community Planning Assistants for Wildfire, specifically Molly Mowry and Kelly Johnston. These are two people who have worked extensively across the country, helping different jurisdictions of different scales really plan for wildfire. And a lot of times this planning is focused in wildland urban interface areas. And so we really wanted to get a better idea of what they're seeing across the country. What are some things that maybe some challenges, some considerations, some lessons learned that we could take to Washington that they had experience in Colorado or maybe even in Tennessee or Minnesota. They gave us a lot of great background information. And because they had also worked in 3 different jurisdictions in Washington, they had some good outsider and kind of wider expertise that they could lend us in terms of how they saw some of the wildland urban interface challenges for Washington and how those compared for some of the other WUI challenges that they saw across the country. We then also talked with a bunch of other Western states at different, representatives who are from different other Western states at different scales, different jurisdictions, and represented different types of industries that people are going to be working in who work in the WUI. So talking with folks at the city level in terms of what that implementation, that mapping of the WUI at a city level, what were some of the challenges and considerations, things that they would change or lessons learned. Talked with ex-fire marshals. We talked with folks who are working on wildfire mapping currently in Oregon. As you see, we really tried to talk with a wide variety of folks, talked with folks in Wisconsin who mapped the national wildland urban interface map and really wanted to see that how we were approaching it. Were we considering everything we needed to, and were we thinking about this, and were we planning from a sound place, or did we have any additional things that were large challenges that we weren't necessarily considering? One of the particular conversations that was especially helpful for us was a conversation with Eva Corral and Greg Dillon, who gave us who actually gave us a base script that they had developed for a wildland urban interface in Chelan. And after looking at the script and thinking about the different conversations we had, considerations, challenges of folks that we had already talked to, we were able to determine that this was going to be a really good base script that we could use and tweak for our own purposes for Washington. And so we were really thankful that we had a conversation with them. And now I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to let Kirk take over, and he's going to talk about some of his particular work on this.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. So we kind of want to walk everybody through what it took or what it takes to create the WUI. And give us a second while we do the transition here, but I think, yeah, I've got control. So there really are two big pieces, and it's very easy to understand conceptually, right? You have structures and you have wildland. So if you have a really good data set of structures in your county, we can use that to create a really good WUI. And likewise, we had to find a way to define what we're calling wildland and how we use it in an analytical process to map out the WUI. So as we move forward, the next slides may be a little bit overwhelming. Just remember that at the heart, it's really just the intersection of these two things with some more definitions sprinkled in. So we developed from the scripts we got from Rocky Mountain Research Station this flow chart, which basically defined everything that they were doing. Now this might not look as great on your computer, but what we want to show here is that there's inputs, there's some data preparation, and then some data analysis that happens. And at the very end, everything gets combined into a final WUI raster. And I'm using that term raster, which might be unfamiliar for some people. And it's just a type of spatial, it's a spatial data type, which is a lot like an image, right? So there's cells that are a certain size, and each cell has a value, much like a cell in a picture has a color. So for us, we're using rasters to do this whole analysis. So we move from our structures and our fuel model, the kind of two pieces at the top, right, which represent the structures and the wildland. So look at these, and then you see the input, the structures, and the fuel model will represent our wildland. And we go through and we do some preparation on those. We create some point density rasters, we create some structure density rasters, some percentage vegetated rasters. That's a key piece here. And then everything gets compiled with very specific rule sets, which help define what exactly interface is, what exactly intermix is, and it actually ends up being very accurate to those definitions. And so if you guys want to read more into this, we've included this as a handout that you'll get with this presentation. So no need to follow along with this right now. We'll talk a little bit now about this first part and what those inputs kind of look like. So the veg cover, it's important for us to determine what is burnable, right? That's kind of the key piece here. So we use burnable versus non-burnable fuel models. And so if something is burnable and it's got 50% vegetation cover, then yes, we consider it wildland. If it doesn't, then it doesn't meet the definition. Now, there are other definitions that happen in the background which influence how the interface is called. And that's basically areas that aren't vegetated that are within 2.4 or 4.2 kilometers from an area that's 75% vegetated or more. So those definitions are all in that flow chart that you saw above. But this is how we're defining veg cover. So addition to that, we chose to look at the national land cover data and the land fire data for the Western US. And Ashley, feel free to speak to some of this if you'd like to. But what we ended up determining was that the land fire data, if you're unfamiliar with it, a quick Google search has all the information.
Kirk, we actually this is one of the sources that we looked at, but we could actually switch over to 2 slides ahead and just kind of go over what are some of the specifics that we had for why we chose land fire. Because I feel like this is a better synopsis, and it's a lot on the screen. So yeah, sorry. Go ahead though.
Yeah, Yeah, so I mean, yeah, basically like land fire was the best. I mean, it's related to wildland fire applications, specifically at a regional level, right? So we're looking at a large scale, and it was better at pulling out forest lands, you know, and fuel types are just a lot better for determining whether or not something's burnable. So the national land cover data is also really good and has been refreshed. And it honestly is probably the most accurate, but land fire was just, it was what they were using at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and it just helped influence us to, you know, make our decision to choose that to determine our wildland. So, yeah, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah. So we just really wanted to make sure that we weren't taking a base script and just running with it. And so,
did we lose you, Ashley? I guess I can keep rolling. Everyone can still hear me, right? All right. So just thinking back to what we had before, right? We had structures and wildland. One of the key pieces within the WUI is the density of the structures that you have. And so those are defined in that international code and in the Silvis definitions for WUI. And so the breakout of the WUI that we have determines whether or not things are very low in density, low, medium, or high. And high is basically 120 structures per 40 acres, right? So it's always in a reference to a 40-acre kind of moving circle is the best way to think about it from an analytical standpoint. So you have this circle that moves around. So these are the classifications that we use. Is that Ashley? Can I hear you that you're back?
Yeah. Sorry about that. I got disconnected, so I apologize for being off, but it sounds like you guys are still rolling. So I'll just chime in when needed, but go ahead, Kirk.
Okay. So now we're going to get into the interesting part. So structures are really like at the heart of, you know, this is where counties can have the biggest impact into like what gets shown as WUI and what doesn't, right? So we used a couple of different structure data sets in Washington State to use as the input for structure density. And one of them, the first one that we want to talk about, is the Microsoft open source structure data set, and that's basically like 124 million building footprints that were created in this gigantic modeling process. I mean, Microsoft is behind it, and they open sourced all the data. And it tends to be really accurate, but sometimes it tends to overestimate what a building is. And there are some striping which will show basically structures that get called out in like wilderness areas, which definitely aren't there. So in urban areas, this data was really, really good. And what we do is we take the polygons and we convert them to points to then feed into the structure density piece of this. So that was one data set that we used. And it is like true structures on the ground, like what it can see. All in all, like a really good data set. So we also had access to the Washington State Master Address Service. And I'm sure that the counties here have been involved in this NextGen 911 project. You guys may actually know a lot more about it than I do. But in the back end of the Washington Master Address database, there's 3.4 million addresses which have been geocoded. So the lat longs are set. Now, there's some things about these locations that are important to note. Like, you know, you may have addresses that are tied to a street, like in the middle of the street, or you might have 5 addresses in a cul-de-sac that all show up on the same point at the beginning of the cul-de-sac. It just depends on where the county was when they submitted that information to the folks that were working on the Washington State Master Address Service. So what we did is we took this data and we converted it to points and kind of did the same thing. And we used them as like pseudo structures. So where there's an address, we're assuming that someone's there, right? That doesn't cover every possible case, right? There's people who have a mailbox in the middle of nowhere, and that would have an address, but it worked really well for what we wanted. but it also tended to underestimate where homes are just because of the nature of, when counties can submit data and when it's reflected in that service. So we're going to take a look now at what those all combined, basically taking the structure density, taking the wildland stuff, the percent vegetation, and combining them into the different rasters. We're just going to dive straight in. We're not going to look at each of these definitions because we'll have given that to you as a handout, hopefully by the time you watch this or if you're live right now. But let's take a look at some of the first versions of the WUI, and then we'll discuss a little bit more about things we did to help improve it, right? Because we noticed like we have two different structure data sets. They're both not perfect. And we know that like the counties could give us like a perfect structure data set, some of them, right? And you're our audience. And so we know that you guys have that data. So we wanted to create the, if you gave us better structure data, we would have a better WUI, but we think we've done a good job so far of capturing it at a regional level. But let's just dive right in. So this was the version, what we'll deem like version 1.1, and this was the WUI, and this is only showing where there's wildland urban interface, so either intermix or interface. And you'll see a lot of striping over the mountains and a lot of kind of speckling around like the ag land in eastern Washington. And those are the false positives that are a part of the Microsoft Structures data set. And so they caveat that data heavily, saying like, don't just take our data one for one and assume it'll work. And we definitely saw that in this first version. But it showed us that we were going the right direction. You can see a lot of the urban areas light up, and a lot of the kind of rural areas, think of like the Iniat River Valley, the Wenatchee Valley, like, more rural areas are lighting up really well, and it's exactly what we want to see. So zooming in a little bit more, just to take a closer look at the striping, you can definitely see that there's not structures in the stripes here in the mountains. So we had to figure out a way to address this. And there they are again, kind of highlighted a little bit better. So the overestimation is actually good in some cases, right? So in this area, we have a spot where we're getting more structures than we would get in the Washington Master Address Service. And so we wanted a way to preserve those. And you'll see the difference here. On the left, we have WAMAS as the Washington Master Address Structures-based WUI. And in this area, which we looked at in an aerial photo, there's tons of homes up there, but they weren't showing up in the Washington Master Address Service. Maybe they don't have addresses. Maybe it's a new, a new development. Maybe all the addresses are at the end of the road for those structures. You just never know exactly how these things have been structured. And then we look at the Microsoft one and we can see like, wow, there's like a huge development in there. So we decided to take a closer look at this and just kind of highlight this as the difference. So you have these yellow dots are the Microsoft structure points, and the red dots are the Washington Master Address Service. You can see that there's one dot out here is really the only thing that gets picked up from the rest of these, whereas the rest are kind of down here. And zooming in even further to just where it looks like there's only like 4 structures, they're actually indeed the Microsoft Structures data set is able to pull out, about like 6 structures, including outbuildings and garages and things. So we really wanted to find a way that we could preserve these Microsoft structures in a future version of the WUI. And so what we decided to do, just thinking about it, we ended up using improved parcels to fuse both structure layers together. And so we had a 2019 version of statewide parcels. I'm sure that everyone from the county gets excited when someone asks them for their parcel data. And this was an like a WATEC-based statewide parcel data gathering effort. And it was very new. And when we first started this project, it didn't exist. And the statewide parcels that did exist were just a little bit out of date to trust. And so these ones luckily had a column of improved value. And that let us know, is there a structure there or not? And so the kind of flow here that we used is, if the parcel is improved, kind of following to the left here, does it intersect, oh, whoops, I kind of hit the back arrow. So if the parcel is improved, does it intersect any Microsoft structures points? If it does, add those points to this fused structures layer. If it doesn't, does it intersect any Washington master address points? If it does, add those to the structures layer. And if it doesn't intersect anything, then continue searching. Now, if we also wanted to capture those areas where the Washington Master Address Service might be more accurate than the Microsoft structures, so we look, is the parcel unimproved? Does it intersect any Washington Master Address Service points? If so, add it to the structures layer. And that's how we were able to create this like fusion of Microsoft structures and Washington Master Address points, which actually does a really, really good job at showing where the structures are in Washington. And it ends up going from, this kind of 3 million structures to 4.8 million structures. And that's including outbuildings and like all the buildings in cities. And it was actually a really cool effort. You know, when you're dealing in, you have millions of parcels and then millions of points. It isn't the most fun analysis to do, but it had the biggest impact on the WUIs, the way that it looked. And ultimately, we want to make a WUI data set that the counties can trust, that in this point, like to the best of our ability, we were trying to define this one, interface or intermix thing. So just to show you what the fused structures end up looking like. So on the left, we have the Washington Master Address structures, the Microsoft structures below that, and then the fused one is able to pull out those improved parcels, the structures that are on those improved parcels, and put them into the WUI. And it actually is a really great product then, so that we can look and we can't like visibly see that we're missing these communities. So that was really cool. In addition to that, this is something that we tried that we determined wasn't going to work for us. But we just wanted to let you guys know that we gave it a try. So we looked at ways to kind of smooth the WUI so that it would kind of snap to political boundaries. And what we ended up doing was overlaying a bunch of statewide polygon layers that were political, lines on the ground. So fire district boundaries, parcels, sections, county boundaries, census block groups. We overlaid a bunch of those together, and then we fractured them by the road system in Washington. And then we took each little slivered polygon and tried to summarize the WUI by that little zone. You think of all the little slivers that are happening in this, what we deemed the pseudo-political layer. And, we tried different combinations of like, okay, if there's any WUI on this sliver, call it all WUI. And it just didn't have the right effect as the raw data did. And ultimately, this is supposed to be kind of guidance or assistance data, and not necessarily like law of the land. So when we put when there's WUI on our map, it's meant to assist counties in applying the WUI code, and not necessarily enforcing anything, except that the definition of the WUI is met in this location.
Kirk, could I add something really fast?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, could you go back to the previous slide just really quickly?
Yes.
Thank you. So one of the reasons that we tried out all of these different boundaries was that some of the different counties, jurisdictions throughout the state have used some of these, or we had heard that other states, different counties in other states had used some of these different boundaries, pseudo-political boundaries, for the purposes of regulation. And so we wanted to see if any of these really made sense for our statewide efforts. However, as Kirk explained, and this is something that we want this to be a raw data. This is used as part of a toolkit. It's not necessarily the only tool. And because every county is going to be a little bit different, our state is so different in terms of vegetation, types of urban areas, types of wildland-urban interface, that it just made sense to leave it more open-ended for the wildland-urban interface to really function as that umbrella that it needed to. And leave this open to, these are some options for how different counties could potentially smooth the boundaries and summarize these things, because there are going to be different ways that counties are going to need to regulate this. And so these are some of the different ways they can, but it's not necessarily something we want to enforce on a statewide level.
Perfect. Well said. So this is ultimately the end product of, I think we've had basically 4 rounds and a bunch of other random analyses. So we're calling this one version 1.4 with fused structures from the Washington Master Address Service and the Microsoft structures. So one thing that we want to let you guys know is that in the process of creating this WUI map layer, we were approached by, was it Nisqually, Ashley?
Yeah, I think so. Well, say what you're going to say, actually. I think it might be Nisqually.
Yeah, so we were, we were approached by, I can't remember where it was, but anyways, a community in the Nisqually that, we showed our WUI map to, and they were like, hey, you're missing our new development. And so they provided us with more, some points that represented those, that development, and we were able to add it into the point data set and rerun the script that creates the WUI. And now that area was now bounded by, intermix, I believe it was. And so it's just to show you that this process is flexible to whatever point structure data set we feed in, right? The wildland is kind of well determined. If you think back to the Venn diagram at the beginning of structures in wildland, but we can vastly improve the structures, and they're ultimately, year to year, the wildland will also change, but the structures can be improved. And so, we ask counties, when they start to take a look at this, we're going to try and implement a method in which we can update this with new and improved structure data, just so that it reflects what you guys see on the ground better. But I think that we've done a really good job at trying to get a good first grab at where the WUI is in Washington.
Great. Can we talk, so I'll take over now just a little bit for talking. One of the other things that we heard from showing these different iterations of different versions of the WUI was that we need a WUI that has some teeth, because WUI is going to continue to grow. There's going to be new structures. There's going to be things that are coming in, and something that a lot of people had concerns with was that if we have these defined edges of WUI that are set in stone, then counties would be more likely, or different jurisdictions would be more likely to take those boundaries and say, okay, well, this is the edge of the WUI for us. However, that doesn't really, that could promote some of the things that we really want to start to be more thoughtful about and regulate more readily across the state. Because one of the main things with the WUI code is that it changes some of the building practices, some of the building materials, building ideas about planning for different areas, to make them more resilient for wildfire purposes, to reduce some of those those risks or to consider those particular factors when planning for risk. So if those boundaries are already set, then that's not much of an impetus for new developments, new single homes to include some of those if they're outside of those wildland urban interface areas. And so the need for teeth was something we heard loud and clear, and we thought about how are we going to include this? What makes the most sense for how to include future WUI? And so we were looking at the map and thinking, well, where could people develop? And it's a lot of area. It's a lot of area that could potentially have future structures on it. And so instead of calling everything, so right now on this map that everyone sees on their screen, the vegetated uninhabited is basically future WUI. It is areas that could potentially be inhabited, could have structures, could have development on them in the future. But then the lighter green are those future non-buildable areas, those areas that are not going to have those developments. And so what that process really was we don't want to just make everything potential future WUI. What are some of the areas that are most likely to not or will not have those developments in the future? And so included in those future non-buildable lands right now is national parks and wilderness areas, because those are under the preservation. They're not necessarily going to have any future developments. However, the lodges, those long-term leases that have houses on the edges of national parks, those are included in the WUI. So structures that are already present in those particular areas are indeed part of the WUI. Those aren't necessarily canceled out. It's just that those are taken out of really the planning considerations that are being included for the WUI and how we're mapping this. Okay, so the one thing that we really wanted to close on here was that wildland urban interface, the map, is not synonymous with wildfire risk. And this is something that we've heard repeatedly that folks have encountered who have already done some mapping, but then also just through conversations we've had. And it's really important that everyone who is using the wildland urban interface map knows that it is not the only tool that should be used to determine wildfire risk. It's part of a toolkit and should be included in planning for how to enforce some of the international wildland urban interface code, but is not the only thing. And so we wanted to call some additional factors in that are really tied to risk for a potential area. And these are the 3 factors that are outlined in the International Wildland Urban Interface Code from 2018. So fuel loading, and this is all data that is available at regional scales and can be included. And we encourage that if it makes sense for counties, for different jurisdictions to use it, that these are things to consider. However, there are additional factors that other counties have used as well. But fuel loading, all of the data that we've used for land fire falls into one of the different fuel type categories. And so this fuel loading data is available that really gives a good indication of how much fuel is on the ground in that particular area. Just the presence or absence of fuel is going to vary widely in terms of how much fuel is actually on the ground, how it's going to burn, and what factors to consider in that regard. Slope is also a huge factor, and this is something that, again, is called out in the international code. So fuels or fire is going to move much more quickly upslope than it will on flat or downhill. And so thinking about that for planning is huge. And then another factor that's included in the international code is the critical fire weather days. And this is really defined by those days that have higher than average wind speed as well as lower than average relative humidity. And these particular factors are really different across the state. A low RH day in Aberdeen is going to be really different than it would be in Spokane. And so these need to be more localized. They need to be considered at a more local scale, more regional scale in terms of what really makes sense. The international code also has a template, a kind of calculation framework that can be used to determine what those critical fire weather days really are. And then using that data and coordinating it with slope, fuel loading, but also where the WUI occurs is something we really encourage counties to use when utilizing the WUI data and really planning for how to implement any regulations in addition to the ones that are included in the Washington State Building Code associated with with the Wildland Urban Interface, the international code from 2018, which are now part or will be part of our state laws. So, Kirk, did you have anything else to add on this slide? Otherwise, I think we are open for questions. If anyone has any particular questions or anything they want clarification on in this presentation.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. Just that folks know that we are starting to incorporate the WUI into various risk analyses that we're doing at the state and like the regional level internally for planning efforts. So we're starting to use the WUI as an internal tool, and because I could see you going through this webinar and then being like, well, how do I use it? Where do I get it? Right. And that's where we're at now, is determining the best way to like release this. And, you know, we have the options of creating kind of like a web application, which would allow you to download the WUI or to view it and interact with it and interact with, you know, I don't want to say these risk factors because we may not necessarily be including those, but you know, at least give you one point where you can go and kind of get familiar with how it was created and where the WUI is in your county. So that's like the kind of next steps for us, is like the release of this. However, if you want like if you want access to it, you know, now, like I want to see it now, we can always give you kind of like a draft version of what we have now before it's officially released, because we're all about transparency and giving people all the information that they need. So hopefully Ashley's not cringing when I said that too.
Oh, not at all. No, and I'll just add that's already been occurring at some level. People have asked us about it. And so yeah, like Kirk said, we want this to be a really transparent effort. This is something where we want that feedback and we want to hear from you. And like Kirk also mentioned, this is something that's going to be a living tool. It's going to be improved over time. With Nisqually, we were able to update some of the reservation's new developments very rapidly. And so this has to be something where all parties are really working together to make this as effective and true of a tool as it should be. Okay.
So, thanks for watching, everyone. And yeah, feel free to reach out to either of us if you have questions about this, or like I said, if you want access. So before we officially release it.
Right. Yeah. We're happy to share the materials as is right now. So yeah, thanks again for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.